Hi YouTube friends, it's Diaper Kiddo Jason, and Domino is here somewhere, and it is finally time to finish our bedtime story, Tarisan and the Toad. I apologize wholeheartedly for the amount of time that it's taken me to finish this, but I think I finally worked out a solution for storage on my phone so that I'm able to record this in full. The third part is the longest part, and so I've had some trouble with my phone being able to hold the video, but I think I've got that fixed. And so, as promised, here is the final installment. When last we met our intrepid hero, Prince Tarisan, he had achieved his mother's second task, which was to go into the world and find the most beautiful ring. And once again, his brothers protested that he had won, stating that the test that they were given was not a true test of kingship. And so this time the queen sent them into the world and gave them 6 months for the final challenge to find true love. And that this would be the final time that she would challenge them. Whoever won this challenge would be the king. And so once again, the eldest brother, Reinhold, traveled north into the city at the heart of the kingdom. The middle brother, Baron, traveled south to the small village where his sweetheart Alia lived. And the youngest prince, Tarisan, traveled to the forest in the west. And he met with his friend, the talking toad spirit, who had helped him with the previous 2 challenges. But this time he decided that he just really doesn't want to be the king. He doesn't feel that he would make a very good king. And so instead he decided to spend the next 6 months that he has free with the toad. And they spent that time together, and during that time a number of things happened. He learned more about the forest, but most notably, on the last night before he was due to leave, the toad revealed an important truth to him, that the toad had fallen in love with him. But the toad wasn't actually a toad. The form that he took was that of a toad, but it was actually a forest spirit, a man by the name of Andaramis. And so Tarisan learned the truth about the toad, and Tarisan fell in love with him. And so that's where we left off. So let's go ahead and conclude our story. The next morning, Andaramis woke the sleeping prince. The two were lying intertwined in Tarisan's small bed in the shack at the edge of the pond. Tarisan, the former toad said, "I have decided something." Tarisan yawned. "What is it, dear heart?" "I wish to return with you to your mother's castle. I have not left the forest in many years, but I think it would be a good thing to go with you." Andaramis smiled and gently caressed Tarisan's cheek with his hand. "Are you sure?" asked Tarisan, sitting up a little. "What about the forest?" Andaramis laid his head on Tarisan's bare chest. "The forest will manage itself for a short time. And after all, your mother did say to bring back your true love." He laughed a musical little laugh. "That is true," said Tarisan. He frowned. "But I worry. I do not care very much what my family thinks about who I choose to love. But I would not want them to say anything that might upset you. I don't think my family expects me to bring back a young man, spirit or otherwise, and if they were cruel to you, I don't think I could ever forgive them." "My love, I am not a delicate flower, remember? Though I look to be your age, I was born more than 1,000 years ago. In that time I have witnessed many great tragedies, and I doubt very much that your family could possibly be as bad as some of those things." He smiled, and Tarisan's heart melted. "Very well then, Mother told me to bring back my love, and that is what I will do. I don't suppose you could take the form of a girl, though. That would certainly make everything easier." Tarisan laughed, and Andaramis laughed with him. Then Tarisan took Andaramis' head in his hands and kissed him fiercely, and the two were very late getting out of bed that morning. It was afternoon before the two lovers left their private little clearing for the road leading west to the Queen's great castle. Tarisan had worried that his horse wouldn't be able to carry them both for 3 days, but Andaramis had laughed and changed into a great white stallion. And though he jested earlier, Tarisan didn't really want Andaramis to take a female form, if he was even able to do so. Tarisan loved him just as he was. During the 3-day journey to the castle, the pair laughed and talked, but Tarisan's mind was a secret cloud of doubt. A man who loved men was something never spoken of in the castle, though Tarisan had overheard some of the crude names the stable boys liked to call each other when they fought. He had a strong feeling that his family would not respond warmly to Andaramis. Still, he had not lied when he told Andaramis he didn't care about his family's opinion. For the first time in his life, he knew what it meant to love and to be loved. For the first time, he wasn't lonely. He was overjoyed to be able to love Andaramis, to touch him and kiss him and hold him in the night. But, nevertheless, he worried. At last, the day had come. Tarisan and Andaramis had finally arrived at the castle. Tarisan's stomach was in knots as he rode his horse through the great plaza before the castle. Andaramis, still in stallion form, was bristling with anxiety. When Tarisan dismounted, the stable hands rushed to take his horse away. When they began to lead Andaramis to the stable as well, Tarisan intervened and wove his hands into Andaramis' mane. The stable hands shook their head and muttered to themselves, but they would never defy their prince. Tarisan led Andaramis to a dark alley between a pair of small shops. Once he checked to see if anyone was watching, he nodded to Andaramis, who evaporated into his human form. For just a brief moment he was naked, and Tarisan's heart quickened. But then he shimmered once more, and was suddenly dressed in fine white robes. The two quickly and anxiously kissed for a moment. "Ready?" asked Tarisan. "If I say no, will it really change anything?" asked Andaramis with a nervous smile. Tarisan took his hand, and the two walked up the 100 steps at the end of the plaza, and then into the castle. Tarisan led them toward the huge audience chamber, which was a cheery, roaring noise. Apparently, all of the kingdom had turned out for the return of their princes. In the outer hall, just outside the audience room, Tarisan turned to Andaramis. "When we enter the room, stay in the back of the crowd until I call for you. I must go forward and stand with my brothers until my mother, the queen, enters. I did not expect this many people to be here, and I don't know how they will react. So, be ready to flee, and I love you. No matter what may be said, know that nothing changes that fact." Andaramis nodded, love and fear intermingled upon his pale face. The pair rounded the corner, and Tarisan gasped. The number of people in the audience chamber was staggering. After pausing to collect himself and to squeeze Andaramis' hand, he strode into the room. Andaramis quickly blended into the crowd, watching nervously. Reinald and Baron were already standing at the far end of the room, facing the throne. The crowd on the floor had parted to give them a wide berth, smiling and waving and tossing garlands of flowers, while the people in the grandstands cheered and called out. A beautiful girl stood close to Baron. No doubt this was Aelia, his betrothed. Reinald stood alone, wearing a look of supreme calmness and joy. It was an alien expression on his brother's face, and Tarisan wondered at it. The youngest prince assumed his place at his brother's side. A herald walked in front of the throne to address the crowd. Tarisan felt his heart beating quickly in his chest, and he hoped he didn't look as frightened as he felt. He turned his head to scan the audience for Andaramis, but he could not see him. "Citizens of Salaman," shouted the herald, "today is a day of great celebration. After 2 seasons of journey, our princes have returned to us. And I present to you our beloved Queen Celestra." The herald bowed low to the crowd and stepped back as the trumpeters played a fanfare, and the crowd applauded loudly. Tarisan wiped the sweat from his brow. The queen, supported by 2 nurses, slowly walked toward the dais. Her nurses helped her up the 3 steps and to her throne. Tarisan gasped, for his mother looked much older and more feeble than he'd ever seen her. Her hair had turned completely gray, and her body was small and shriveled. It was apparent that she was not long for the world. The queen slowly seated herself tiredly and then raised a hand. The cheering of the audience quickly silenced. "My people," the queen started, but then she began coughing. The crowd looked on with concern. After brushing her fussing nurses aside, she composed herself, and a moment later began again. "My people, as you know, I am very old, and soon my time will come to an end. Before you stand my 3 fine sons, the future of Salaman. 6 months ago, I put them to a test of kingship. Their task was to find true love. Now my beloved sons have returned to me, and today I will pass the crown of Salaman on to one of them. My sons, please come forward." She beckoned to the 3 princes. Tarisan, Reinald, and Baron each took a step toward the throne. Tarisan felt that his legs would give way at any moment, and he concentrated very hard on not acquainting his face with the floor. "My son, Prince Reinald, I sent you into the world to find true love. What do you present to me?" asked the queen, her voice weak. However, despite her poor health and exhaustion, her voice was rich with strength and love. Reinald took another step forward and spoke out. He sounded more mature and sure of himself than Tarisan remembered. "My mother, 6 months ago I left your castle in search of that which I loved more than anything else. I traveled north to the great city in the heart of our kingdom, and for 6 months I lived among your subjects. I learned the ways of our people, and I worked to aid the suffering I found. I learned of their needs, their hopes, and dreams, and in that time I shed my boyhood, and I truly became an adult. I saw great joy and great sadness. I saw bounty and starvation. I saw wealth and poverty. And most of all, I saw great hospitality and compassion. The people of Salaman are that which I love more than anything else. This is the love which I present to you." As Reinald finished speaking, the people in the audience erupted into applause. The queen nodded proudly, her eyes filled with happy tears. Reinald had truly changed from the silent, serious, introverted man he'd been before. Baron thumped Reinald's back proudly, a huge grin on his face. The queen raised a hand again, and the uproar quieted. "My son, Prince Baron, what love do you present to me today?" Her eyes glanced to Aelia, glittering knowingly, and a small smile turned at the corner of her mouth. Reinald stepped back to resume his place, and Baron stepped forward. "Mother, I wish for you to meet my beloved Aelia, to whom I am betrothed." He turned, and Aelia stepped forward to stand at his side. She was a beautiful girl, with long black hair and braids. Her skin was white as alabaster, and she had a kind face and a warm smile. "Your Majesty," Aelia said, curtsying, her voice ringing through the chamber. The queen beckoned her forward, and the 2 women embraced. Aelia then returned to Beren, who took her hand and held it lovingly. "Mother," Beren said, smiling, "never before have I felt such love as I feel for Aelia. In the 2 seasons that I was away, I spent my time living with Aelia and her family. I aided her father in his farmstead, and I learned the workings of a farm. Never have I been happier than living amongst her folk, working with the land. This is why I wish to return to her village and live out my life there, with Aelia at my side. With your permission, I wish to wed Aelia at the next feast day and renounce my claim to the rule of Salaman." The audience gasped with surprise, and even the queen was taken back for a moment. But she nodded, smiling joyfully, and the crowd immediately roared their approval. Reinald and Tarisan then embraced Aelia, welcoming her into the family, as was the custom of Salaman. After the audience had settled down again, the queen turned to Tarisan. He was so nervous that he felt any stray puff of wind would carry him far away. "My son Tarisan, youngest prince of Salaman, what love do you bring before me today?" Tarisan felt the piercing gaze of everyone watching him expectantly. In an instant of panic, he worried that his voice would fail him. "Mother," he said, trying to hold his voice steady, "through each of your 3 tasks, I traveled east, into the great forest. Each time, I met a kind soul who aided me and granted me the gifts that I brought before you. In this, the final test, I returned to that person to seek counsel. And during the last 2 seasons, we spent endless days talking and sharing secrets. In the end, I found a love greater than I could have ever imagined. It is my only wish to spend the remainder of my lifetime feeling the warmth and the encompassing joy of this love. In this, no other detail should matter. It is my deepest hope that you will welcome my love as you have welcomed Aelia, my sister. Though, no matter your decision, you are my mother and will always be in my heart." Tarisan gulped, then turned toward the audience and raised his arm. Andaramis stepped forward, and Tarisan felt a surge of love and courage. Andaramis took his place at Tarisan's side, and the 2 held hands firmly. Both were trembling. In the briefest moment of hysteria, Tarisan couldn't help but think it amusing that Andaramis was as afraid of his family's reaction as Tarisan was, for all his brave words a few days ago. But he immediately sobered and squeezed Andaramis' hand for reassurance. The audience was utterly silent. No one coughed, no child cried. Everyone in the room was stunned. Beren, ever sure of himself, was the first to recover. "This is an insult, a blasphemy!" he shouted wildly. "Tarisan, how dare you? You insult our kingdom and our queen with your perversion, with this!" He gestured furiously to Andaramis, who stood his ground and gazed coolly at Beren. Tarisan shrank back a little, but did not avert his eyes from his brother. "Beren, you are my brother, and for that I love you. But you will not speak of him in such a way. I do not seek your approval, and I am not addressing you. I am speaking to the queen, and you will hold your tongue until I finish." Beren glared at Tarisan with a look of pure disgust, but did not retort. He stepped away from Tarisan and Andaramis, and stood at Reinald's side, well away from the lovers, pulling Aelia with him. Her face was stained with tears, and she clung to Beren, overcome with the emotion of the scene. She looked at Tarisan, her eyes full of sympathy and pity and understanding. He loved her dearly for it. Tarisan turned to the eldest brother, unsure what to expect. Reinald stood where he was, unmoving, watching Tarisan, with an inscrutable expression on his face. In a way, that concerned Tarisan even more than Beren's outburst, but he would no doubt know where Reinald stood in a moment. He instead turned to his mother. "Mother, this is Andaramis, and I love him. I proudly declare it to all the kingdom, for I am not ashamed. I love you with all my heart, but not even for you will I feel shame in this." He turned to address the still silent audience. "You may think what you will of me, but it will not change the fact that I love the man standing at my side. He is a kind, compassionate, wonderful person, and my life has been enriched more than any of you can understand. For all of my life, I have lived in the shadows of my brothers. Reinald was the oldest and the most wise of us, and Baron was the strong, popular one. I have always felt alone, a deep loneliness so strong that I became numb to it. I lived in the shadows, and I was content there. But now I feel complete, and nothing in this realm will ever steal that away from me. Andaramis owns my heart, for now and for always. He turned to look directly at Andaramis, and Tarisan was surprised to find his eyes full of tears. His love for Tarisan and his pride at Tarisan's words were overflowing. Suddenly, from one of the back walls, Tarisan heard someone shout, "The prince is a pervert!" Suddenly, the hall rang with harsh echoes and cruel words as members of the audience cried out, "Pervert! Freak! Abomination!" they cried. "Get out of our kingdom! We don't want your kind here!" they called down to Andaramis. "Silence!" Everyone in the room turned to see who had bellowed. The queen was standing, her arm on the armrest of her throne for support. "You are my subjects, and you shall remain silent until I command it. That means all of you," the queen shouted, glaring at Baron. He wilted under her gaze, for though she was frail, the queen was still a formidable force. She stared silently, her eyes moving over the crowd, her chest heaving. Her gaze was a challenge, and no one spoke out. She remained standing, her frail legs trembling, and only holding her up through sheer force of will. She continued to survey the crowd as she spoke. "Who among you would judge Prince Tarisan? For what crime do you condemn him? He is absolutely right. He has always remained in the shadow of his brother Reinald and his brother Baron. For long I have worried about him. He has always been a lonely child, and I worried that he was unhappy. But at last I see him before me, truly happy. There is a great love between my son and this man Andaramis that is plain to see. So I ask again, who among you would judge my son? Who among you would condemn Andaramis as a pervert? Who of you would question the absolute right of the virtue of love?" No one answered, and many hung their heads in shame. Tarisan was trembling, and Andaramis had to steady him to keep him from collapsing. The queen continued, "Tarisan, my son, I do not care if this person you love is a man or a woman. I only care that you are loved. Love is the most powerful force in this world, and few people ever truly understand what that means. When your father, King Tarisan, died all those years ago, my heart was rended to pieces. Nothing in my life has ever hurt more than losing your father. For he was a great man and a great king, and he filled me with love to make the sun grow dim with shame. Yet the pain of losing him was small coin to pay for the reward of his love. It was my deepest fear that you would never know true love, for you were so isolated as a child and had become an isolated adult. But now you stand before me, willing to sacrifice everything for this love you feel." She turned to Andaramis. "Do you love my son, and will you treat him well? Will you always be at his side, no matter what comes?" "Great Queen, I love Tarisan more than my own life. I would die 1,000 deaths for him," Andaramis said. She turned to Reinald and Baron and said, "Then I challenge anyone in this kingdom to tell me that this love is not real and valid and pure." Reinald stood before Tarisan and placed his hand on Tarisan's shoulder. "Brother," he said, "I am truly happy for you. As the queen said, you were always a lonely child and have become a lonely man. Andaramis clearly makes you happy, and so I congratulate you both. With that, he embraced Tarisan and hugged him tightly. When they finally moved apart, Tarisan was surprised to see a tear on Reinald's face. He was even more surprised when Reinald embraced Andaramis and officially welcomed him into the family. Baron snorted, but he had calmed down some and didn't seem as angry. Tarisan walked over to him and extended a hand. Baron stared at it for a moment, then took it, and the two shook hands. Baron was still obviously uncomfortable and upset, though, and it saddened Tarisan. The queen nodded and gestured to Andaramis, who went to her. The two embraced, and the queen whispered in his ear. He nodded, and the two hugged again. An uncertain cheer came from somewhere in the audience, and then another. In a moment, half the hall was cheering. After a time, the queen silenced them. She was sitting down on the throne again, and she looked very tired. "Baron," she said, turning to him, "you yourself have found love. Would you give up Aelia if I requested it?" "I could not," Baron cried. "Aelia is my heart. I could not live without her." "Then, do you expect your brother Tarisan to have the strength that you do not have? To give up what you cannot?" Baron thought for a moment, his face contorted with conflict. After a moment, he strode to Andaramis and embraced him. "I am deeply sorry," he said quietly before returning to Aelia's side. The queen smiled, relieved. "Very well then, Prince Baron, I grant you leave to marry this girl Aelia, and to follow your heart wherever it leads you. And Prince Tarisan, I release you to follow your heart as well. I hereby name Prince Reinald my heir, and I proclaim him the future king of Salaman." The thunderous applause and cheers from the onlooking crowd was greater than ever. Prince Reinald turned to the people of Salaman and bowed deeply, then knelt before the queen. And Tarisan hugged Andaramis close, filling him with the deepest joy and love. He had never been happier than he was in this moment. He had passed the test the queen had laid before him, and had returned with true love indeed. The queen died less than a month later, and the kingdom deeply mourned her loss, for she had been beloved. Reinald was crowned king the day after her funeral, and his reign was long and prosperous. He eventually married a princess from a neighboring kingdom, and they had many children. The people of Salaman called him Reinald the Just, for he loved his subjects deeply and never judged anyone unfairly. Baron and Aelia were married, and they returned to her family's farmstead. When her father passed away a few years later, the couple inherited the farm. They lived out their days contentedly, Baron doing what he loved, and Aelia the perfect farmer's wife. They had 2 fine sons, and a daughter who would one day grow up to become a great figure in the history of Salaman. But that is a story for another day. And what of Tarisan? He and Andaramis returned to the forest to serve as its guardians. Andaramis used his magic to extend his immortality to Tarisan, and the two loved each other for all time. The great forest, once known as the dark heart of the kingdom, became known as True Love Woods, and even today it protects Salaman's eastern border from intruders. People say that the wood is enchanted, and that anyone who enters the forest with any malicious intent in their heart is driven out, raving about ghosts and spirits and talking beasts. And once in a while, a traveler or a wandering merchant shares a tale about 2 kind forest spirits who guided him through the forest when he gotten lost, or saved him from attacking wolves or bears. The spirits in these stories usually take the form of a pair of handsome young men, one with hair of silver and the other with chestnut hair and a kind smile. And that's it, guys. Thank you so much for joining me. I'm just truly grateful that I was able to share this with you. I hope you enjoyed it. I know this was a long and involved process to get to this point. I am going to be recording a proper audio track from start to finish with no preamble, no talking, just the story. And once I do, I'll be putting links to the download for that in the videos for each of the 3 parts, so that you can download it if you like and listen to it when you're trying to fall asleep. But that's it for tonight, guys. Thank you so much. As always, I'm genuinely appreciative that you have allowed me to share this with you. And I hope you have sweet dreams. Bye, guys.